I want to take you back initially, because of the title of this talk, to 2001. I was in my early 30s, and miraculously I got a letter from the United Nations signed by Mary Robinson, who had been the president of Ireland. I was like, what does she want with me? And she had invited me to come to Durban for something I actually hadn't heard about, the World Conference Against Racism. And the event that they invited us to was a side gathering to discuss the idea of hierarchies, castes, race, and so on, which was being, this conference or seminar on the side was being created by Thandika, because he was the head of UN RISD. So I decided, well, I'll go for it. It's interesting. Let's go and see what's happening in South Africa. It's 2001, only 7 years after the first democratic election. So I went with some enthusiasm. All right, we had our little seminar. I made a presentation about caste. I don't think any of you remember this conference, because right at the end of it, those aircrafts crashed into buildings in the United States, 9/11. Just eclipsed the World Conference Against Racism. But at the conference, there was an enormous debate, 3 enormous debates. The first debate was around the question of apartheid in Israel. And the Israeli government mobilized the US government to try and shut down the conference. So that was debate number 1. Man, some things never change. Some things never change. The second debate was over reparations. Several countries, particularly from the Caribbean, were eager, very eager, to put the question of reparation payments on the table. And again, the US government, this is so convenient and again a cliche, US government used the concept of anti-Semitism to say that that demand as well was illegitimate. The third debate was around caste. Was caste actually a form of hierarchy like race? So I'd made that presentation. My presentation was called Cataracts of Silence. Comes from an old poem. The last line of my presentation was, one hopes that their struggles, the struggles of people in India who are fighting against caste hierarchies, one hopes that their struggles will make India truly the world's largest democracy in the fullest sense of the word. Okay, I made my presentation. It was a big room. As I came down, a man came up to me from the Cuban delegation, and he said, can you come tomorrow at 9 o'clock to this hotel room, and so on. I said, what's going on? He said, just keep the day free. It's a Cuban making a demand, impossible to say no. So the next morning, I dutifully, not in a suit like this, because I was much less able to buy. This suit is from China. I think it's pretty nice. But yeah, I'm happy to have it. I don't wear it often, but when I wear it with pride, okay? Yeah, so I went in my jeans and T-shirt, knocked on the door. Well, they opened the door, and there was Fidel Castro sitting in a chair. And he makes me sit down and says, okay, give me a seminar on caste. I don't know anything about caste. So I spent the next 2 hours not really talking. I would say a sentence, and then he would sort of, annotate my sentence. Because remarkably, the greatest thing about Fidel Castro was he had insatiable curiosity and a world of knowledge. So if I mention something, the word caste comes from the Portuguese word casta. That was it. There was now 15-minute Fidel telling me about how the Portuguese created hierarchies in Latin America and so on. It was an incredible day because I spent the day with him, walked around with him and so on. And he was full of energy to talk about reparations, to talk about the issue of indigeneity, which was not being fully addressed. He wanted that firmly on the table, and to explain to people the important concept of the Batalha de Ideias, the battle of ideas. That, for instance, if we didn't confront the major debates of our time with confidence and clarity, we would not go anywhere. If we allowed somebody else to set the terms of discussion, then we would not be able to advance our goals. our genuine full goals of equality and so on. In that sense, he was the best educator because he understood you have to talk to everybody about everything and not just at a surface level, get down to the root. He ended his, or rather in the middle of his address, which he gave to the delegates from different countries. By the way, Fidel was the only delegate, head of government, to speak both at the state level meeting and at the NGO meeting. And in both places, he got a standing ovation, which is a testament in 2001 of where people held him in comparison with where they held other world leaders. When Fidel was speaking to heads of governments, he said, there are enough funds to save the world from tragedy. This line has stayed with me since 2001. There are enough funds to save the world from tragedy. Despite what all the economists of the mainstream were saying at that time about the lack of resources, the difficulties, resource allocation is the key issue. Here was Fidel just putting it on the table. There are enough funds to save the world from tragedy. A really powerful line that demonstrated his method of the battle of ideas. Well, after that exciting day, the next day, Thandika had heard that I'd spent the day with Fidel, and he said to me, well, let's go for a walk. So we went for a walk. And the interesting thing about him was, even when you didn't agree with him, and he and I really didn't agree on much. I mean, I was even more a militant Marxist in 2001 than now. I think I'm just a little more mature as a person, but my ideology is pretty much unmoved from 2001. But he was very good at seeing where people come from, the differences and so on. And I think where that day we really began to see eye to eye was on this issue of both the destruction of the independent space of, let's say, an African political economy, the way to see the countries in Africa on their terms, but also, and crucially, the demise of so many of the important institutions of, let's say, development on the continent. By demise, I don't mean that the doors were shuttered, but their agendas had lapsed. They no longer were vital institutions. And you can think about what has happened to, let's say, the Economic Commission. No longer a vital institution as it perhaps was or should have been. No longer a vital institution. And so many like that. And we were in South Africa, which was already in the throes of the so-called GEAR project of the South African government, the Growth and Redistribution Act. The GEAR project, which was effectively own goal neoliberalism in many ways. So we talked a lot about the institutional deficit, but also the lack of an ideological clarity. You've got to have clarity with the development agenda. Development agendas aren't about small things, And I very much remember, because this sentence is, I almost write it on every one of my notebooks. This sentence is so important to me. I remember having a particular argument with him about people being afraid to try things. Lenin, and here's the sentence, once wrote, if you're too scared that you'll fail, you'll do nothing. If you're too scared to fail, you'll do nothing. And I was making the case that I made 20 years ago, which I made like a stuck record ever since, and probably ever since I went to take my PhD, and therefore annoyed all my graduate teachers and so on. But it was basically the view that I felt that the academic world had become too timid. It was not coming out there and making strong arguments for social transformation. It had become stuck in the margins. Let's do a little thing here. Let's, do some sort of NGO projects over there. If we can just improve the piping for water supply over there, that would be okay. In a way, the academic imagination and the NGO imagination had fused. It was parceled out problems and small-scale solutions. The big questions of social transformation out of the window. And here was the big disagreement with Thandika, and that's why I told Dongo, you basically made my middle point in my talk here. The other main disagreement was on imperialism. Would the major powerful countries in the world allow small, formerly colonized states to drive an agenda, an independent, sovereign agenda? I know that in the previous panel, the name of Thomas Sankara was raised, one of our great heroes, overthrown in a vicious coup d'etat in 1987. But of course, it's not true that Sankara was the last of the progressive governments. There have been several attempts over the years on the African continent, but again, people get squeezed, not only from the left. I had previously, about 5-6 years before the Durban meeting, I'd spent a few days with Alpha Omar Konare, who was the head of government in Mali. And Konare was telling me, he had come to office, new democratic, all this, this word democracy, all these new democratic initiatives. Konare was going to help Mali get on a different path. And when I interviewed him, he said, look, we don't have the resources. Remember that line from Fidel? There are enough funds to save the world from tragedy. He said, we don't have enough resources because we're carrying a massive, odious debt. And if only the Western bondholders would either give us a haircut on the debt or that we would be able to get some sort of really concessionary funding to erase the debt, reschedule it or something like that, then I would have the resources, Konare said, to deal with problems like the issues raised regarding the Tuareg in the north or regarding the question of, agriculturalists in the middle of the country and so on. And when Konare went to Washington and made the plea to the United States asking the IMF to act, because the IMF, those who've ever actually talked to people in the IMF, there until recently was a relationship between the IMF and the US Treasury, which was like this. It might as well have been the same institution. They basically communicate with each other through a hotline. Very little independence for the IMF officials. Konare goes to Washington, talking to the US Treasury Department, State Department, and so on. And I think it was Anthony Lake who told him that no, Mali has to honor its debts. And of course, Konare was out of office. This is a kind of debt-driven coup d'etat. He was out of office. And then you get the war, or rather the destruction of Libya. And then you get the emergence of Al-Qaeda, largely cigarette smugglers in that part of the world. And then you get the erasure of Malian sovereignty all the way out to 2 coup d'etats now. If you go back and listen to what Konare was saying in the 1990s, there was ample space for a different kind of logic. He was trying to assert Malian sovereignty. Imperialism denied the possibility of sovereignty for Mali. And I think if we set aside the category of imperialism in our thinking on development, we basically tied both our hands behind our back conceptually. We won't have enough realistic, real understanding of how the world works. We'll have a kind of naive theory of power if you don't understand how every time a country has tried to put its sovereignty ahead of the advantages to multinational corporations, those countries get either a coup d'etat, they get some kind of bondholder revolt, some problem will face that country and the government is gone. This happens over and over again. And in fact, there are governments now on the African continent who are trying to put forward a sovereign agenda and they're getting blocked. One of them is the new government in Senegal. The other is the governments in the Sahel region in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And I'm very happy to talk to anybody about the fact that these were formed out of a military coup, as if that is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. It's interesting that we look at these governments and we say, my God, they were shaped out of a coup, and in the same breath we say Thomas Sankara was a hero. How can both things be true? Thomas Sankara came to power in a military coup. Ibrahim Traore dresses like Thomas Sankara, inspired by Thomas Sankara. It's very strange to hear people talk like that, but anyway, separate question. You know this issue. I was a boy in Calcutta reading Shakespeare, okay? Reading Shakespeare, blow, blow, thou winter wind. That's from As You Like It, by the way. That was my class 10 play that I had to memorize. Blow, blow, thou winter wind. What winter wind in Calcutta? It's like 1,000 degrees right through the year. You know, there were all these poems we had to read about flowers that didn't exist in our world. English gardens didn't exist. The city of London, never seen it. We were not reading about our own lives, we were reading about England. And I was in school in the 1970s, for God's sake. What's happened to our brains and our curriculum? The same with economics. You know, for years it's frustrated me that economics is taught in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, as if these countries are Europe. You know, they start economics classes with utility calculations, demand and supply. This is the worst place to start an economics education for a young person sitting in a place like India, for instance. Markets, utility calculations, they don't exist in people's lives. You know, when we talk about savings rates, I was talking to Dongo on the way to lunch. Savings rate, in India, people's savings rate is calculated based on savings accounts. But most people don't save in savings accounts. I don't have a saving account. I have a checking account. I'm lucky to have anything in that stupid checking account. Forget savings account. That doesn't count as national savings. Most people in India, until demonetization, used to keep their savings in cash. Or if you're smart, and this is my agenda on the next few days, I'm going to go to the gold souk here and convert all my savings into gold. Because all the currencies are going to collapse in January of this year when that crazy guy becomes the US president. Again, I'm going to buy all the gold I can, which is not that much. But anyway, Indians love gold. That's where they save. They don't save in cash. They don't save in bank accounts. So you got to teach people economics based on their own reality. You know, years ago, it's funny, you know, I was looking at this idea of the economics textbook, and I was telling Grieve, let's assemble a group of people. Let's start working on producing an online open access economics textbook. And remember, we were saying, let's start by looking at, you know, what actually is the imminent problem on the continent. And so we did a dossier recently on the Democratic Republic of Congo. $24 trillion is the estimated wealth of the Congo. $24 trillion US dollars. And yet 74.6% of the people in the Congo live on less than 2.15 US dollars a day. I mean, that is the first line in your textbook for an African student. How is it that you live in a rich country and everybody's poor? That's the first dilemma that people should deal with. Not what is demand. Because that makes no sense. It's not in people's realities. How can you live in a country like Niger, where you have one of the world's best uranium mines producing yellow cake uranium, but everybody's poor? I mean, I visited Arlit, which is just north of Agadez in Niger, and the place is basically a garrison town of the French. They run the town. You know, it's their town. It's on the way to Sabah, Libya. All the migrants use the same route. You turn left and you get to the uranium mine. It's a really well-organized uranium mine. It's one of the best quality uranium. It powers the lights in France, but not the lights and the industrial capacity of the people in Niger. So I would start any economics textbook not with some abstraction that exists for another context, but by starting with the fundamental question. And I think that's what I mean by, can we build scholarship for our people? Can we build an intellectual agenda that is not alien to people when they come to it? Can we not yell in their faces, blow, blow, thou winter wind, and instead give them something that actually is tangible and makes sense? Look, it's true that around 2001 and so on, it became even more clear, much clearer at that time, that we were in the middle of a counter-revolution in thought. There was the complete reversal of the national liberation literature. At this time, you know, people basically, in fact, you can date it to when a lot of Nkrumah's books start to go out of print. Neocolonialism, which is one of the best books. Let's say it's a dependency theory classic for the African continent. It's stunning when we think of dependency theory. We always think of Latin America, but that's not true. There's a dependency theory tradition on the African continent. It goes from Nkrumah, neocolonialism, all the way out to Rodney and beyond. There are several other people on the continent working through the kind of dependency theory problematic, whether it's Isa Shivji or whoever, Samir Amin, several people. But there is an authentic dependency theory tradition on the African continent, just as there is one in Asia. The Latin American story actually doesn't make sense for these countries. You can't just transpose Andre Gunder Frank and his very pessimistic line about how development is basically underdevelopment. It's an extremely pessimistic line, makes no sense in scaled up countries where they have revolutions like China, which I'm going to come to in a little bit. So the first thing is there is this counter-revolution in thought where basically most of our best thinkers around the world get demoted from thinking. They get removed from curricula and so on. People are not reading even the Arusha Declaration around this time as a good foundational text to try to understand what it means to build a political project on the African continent. In Asia, it's almost as bad, if not worse. In Asia, we stopped reading our national liberation writers. We stopped reading, for instance, even Nehru in the Indian schools. We returned to reading European texts. We went away from reading the people who were trying to understand the Indian reality. Now, I don't want to make a binary, between European thought and, say, African thought. It doesn't exist. Nkrumah is highly influenced by Marx. He's influenced by Du Bois, people he met at the Manchester conference. Later, he'll be influenced by Frantz Fanon, Patrice Lumumba. He sees him as somebody that he was working with. They meet at the Accra conference in 55. I mean, these people were fertilizing each other, but they were thinking for themselves, trying to build an understanding of the world they were living in. That gets set aside. What we begin to see is what Dongo talked about in his presentation. We begin to see a binary appear between the external and the internal, the structural and the cultural. A range of thinkers, particularly in the sort of IMF, World Bank zone, who are around those institutions, began to focus on the so-called internal problems in African countries or Asian countries and so on, and just removed all the external, what were known as external or structural barriers. In fact, imperialism. That was removed from analysis. And internal problems come up. We've just published this dossier on corruption, for instance. Transparency International comes into being in the 1990s is put together by a group of Germans who were in the World Bank. I mean, I was really quite surprised that there is so little critical literature on Transparency International. They focused on what they call public sector corruption. That was their focus of attention. Suddenly, big corporate corruption was not to be looked at. At the same time, the Clinton administration closed down effectively, although they didn't fully close it down, they sent it off to become a trade body. They closed down the UN Center on Transnational Corporations, which had started to build knowledge about what multinational, transnational corporations were doing. All of this was occluded, and the focus of transparency was on so-called public sector corruption. That became the definition of corruption. Everything else was off the screen. And stunningly, their transparency index is an index built of questionnaires given to businessmen over where they feel there's corruption when they go and do business abroad. I mean, it is such an offensive index, and yet, people use it all the time. As if the Transparency Corruption Index is something of authority. There's nothing authoritative. It's a completely ideological device. And I really hope you look at the dossier that we produced, which is out this month. This internal and external divide that they create is quite fascinating. There's a lot of culturalism that comes in here. Whereas the dependency and other kinds of thinkers were interested in what are the constraints, the international, local constraints and so on. They didn't operate, by the way, with an internal-external divide. They were looking at all manner of constraints at different levels, including cultural constraints. I mean, one of the big constraints, which you can read about in Nkrumah's book, and is extremely important, very little studied, is the problem of building a state apparatus. It was mentioned earlier. The issue of the first generation of national liberation governments had a close connect with intellectuals because they had to build the state apparatus. In fact, that state apparatus building was very important, but very fascinating. When we read critiques of structural adjustment policies, this part of it doesn't get the attention it deserves. Many of these structural adjustment policies asked states to freeze wage bills, public sector employee wage bills. One of the things that many states did is they closed down public administration training academies so that you no longer had places where, say, tax officials came in for a serious ideological training on what it means to be a tax official. In India, this place suddenly becomes a kind of seminar room where you go in and you're given big binders of how to do your job, and that's about it. Nobody's taught about what is the spirit of public service, what is the history of national liberation, why are we trying to build a different kind of state. All of that basically stops during the structural adjustment period, because when the wage bill cuts happen, these institutes are either downgraded or closed down entirely. Many countries close them down. They have no real public administration training. And in fact, it's interesting. I was looking for fun, what is the literature on public administration training? I really ask you, go and have a look in different countries. Have people studied the development of the field of public administration? Sounds totally boring, okay? But you can't build a state unless you have competent people who are trained one way or the other to manage state functions, especially when it comes to things like taxation. We put up these graphs, revenue harvesting. These are not things that just happen by computer. You have to actually have a tax authority that's there going out and trying to find out and figure out carefully how do you, in fact, harvest taxation. What are the ways in which you do it? How do you tax octroi duties? How do you tax certain kinds of corporations and so on? In this dossier that we wrote, there's a section on transfer pricing. Because what you'll discover when you read it is that if you don't have a competent tax authority, if you don't have competent, very well-trained people in that section, multinational corporations run circles around the state. They will bill their external subsidiaries for services and therefore say that the costs to the domestic subsidiaries is too high, that there's no profits made here, so no tax will be paid where they are, say, mining for gold. So companies that are mining for gold or mining for diamonds or mining for lithium end up paying minimal taxation. Why? Because they have taken some services from an external arm which they paid, and therefore their profits were low. This is transfer pricing. It is something that most competent tax authorities in our continents can no longer handle. And it's interesting, there's a literature on transfer pricing, or rather the literature calls it transfer mispricing, but the literature again is very, very low on good hard data because you need to get the data from somewhere. And if you don't have competent authorities built up, I don't mean people, I mean the institutions, you're not going to get the data because people don't even know it's happening. So even the illicit financial flows report, it's an estimate. And I think it's an extremely low estimate. The one that you were talking about this morning is an extremely low estimate. And it's a low estimate because nobody's there to, in fact, do the kind of numbers that we need. Okay, another point. How do we begin to build a different kind of development theory? Because that's what I'm really interested in. Where do we even begin? 2021, Grieve wrote a very good paper, Does Economics Have an Africa Problem? He showed between 2005, 2015, 25% of journals had one Africa-based author. Yeah? It was unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, one Africa-based author in 25% of the journals. I mean, who's building the knowledge? That's the first thing that we need to think about. You know, why is knowledge not being built sufficiently in a more distributed manner? Why is knowledge built in some parts of the world and not in other? Why is writing in some parts of the world treated as knowledge and writing from elsewhere not treated as knowledge? Maybe treated just as the creation of data. Why do these hierarchies continue to exist? You know, what's happened is some of it has got to do with money. But the way we've moved out of this a little bit is the idea of collaboration, where people from outside will collaborate with one person on the African continent and so on. That's not sufficient. That's not sufficient. That's almost like data mining. You know, you are getting the advantages because if you are in a university in Europe and you publish a journal article, your salary increases. But somebody who's your collaborator is basically getting data from you in a university in Tanzania, and they are not getting any benefit for that. I mean, there's a way in which this structure has to be really broken down. Maybe we should stop publishing in journals that benefit some university professors and not others. Maybe we should think about a whole new structure of knowledge delivery. I mean, I'm completely opposed to any journal that is behind a paywall, because I think that just reproduces this whole structure of, let's call it the counter-revolution in thought. All journals behind paywalls are unavailable to 90% of the scholars who are working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They just can't get to it, and they don't benefit from being the second author in an article. We need to rethink this structure very seriously. The second thing about this counter-revolution in thought is how economics has been transformed. In 2021, Howard Stein had a terrific article where he pointed to the impact of the African Economic Research Consortium, which was set up in Nairobi in 1988. By the way, this is a very bizarre group, the African Economic Research Consortium. It's basically a World Bank group, which is based in Nairobi and has spent time building an agenda for how African economics should be done. You know, they talk about sound economic research and rigor. I know what these words mean, what these phrases mean. They don't really mean sound economic research. They don't really mean rigor. They mean cut and paste IMF doctrine. If you're not cutting and paste IMF doctrine, it's not going to be treated as rigor. It's very clear cut. And you see that was in 88 founded, 94. I'm sure all of you have read The Great Adjustment in Africa, Reforms, Results, and the Road Ahead, the very famous World Bank study from 1994. I'm sure everybody's read it. There are two parts of that study that just drive me nuts. One is the emphasis on foreign direct investment. So toward the end of the study, they write, the region's resistance to foreign capital is one explanation for why there's no development. Okay, the region's resistance to foreign capital. I'm not going to comment on it, I'll come back. The second one is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship. There was a graph earlier on opening of firms, private firms and multinational firms. But that was a graph that wasn't weighted, meaning it could be small firms or big firms. I don't think that was a weighted graph. You could have a lot of firms in a country. Let's take, any country on the African continent. You can have lots of small firms opening up shops and so on, but they are not the scale of, say, when Rio Tinto comes to town. So one Rio Tinto is, millions times more powerful than thousands of little firms if they open up. But anyway, here's what the World Bank wrote in 94. African governments sometimes shoot themselves in the foot by tacitly or openly encouraging the harassment of successful entrepreneurs. What a great line. What they mean is, liberalize, open up, let Rio Tinto come to town, mine your resources and go out, let them transfer price. Don't harass them. What a word to use. they shoot themselves in the foot by encouraging the harassment of successful entrepreneurs. You can't read that and think they're talking about some individual kid, who came up with a good idea. They're talking about barriers to big multinational corporations. This is what they want removed. Because when they come and make their final list, they talk about getting macroeconomic policies right, which means a realistic exchange rate. When I see the word realistic, I want to reach for my gun. Because the word realistic, you know what it means. It doesn't mean realistic. It means what somebody else likes. This is exactly the word used during the Plaza Accord, when the United States government had Japan revise the interest rates to prevent Japanese exports flooding the US market. They also argued for a realistic exchange rate. And when the US government was trying to get China to revise its exchange rate, they also used the phrase, we would like to see a realistic exchange rate. So let there be no confusion. The word realistic doesn't really mean realistic. What it means is what the US Treasury Department wants. Second, encourage competition. So they say we need to privatize public enterprises. Okay, no surprise there. And then use scarce institutional capacity. I have never understood what they mean by using scarce institutional capacity. When you read it in more detail, it basically means you transform things like your Institute for Public Administration and make it into what they made the UN Center for Transnational Corporations, which is a cultural adapter to help foreign companies come in and learn how to do business in your country. That's exactly what they did to the UN Center for Transnational Corporations when they moved it from being an independent body to being a small office in Geneva at the UNCTAD office. In the UNCTAD office, they kept a database to help multinational corporations enter jurisdictions where they hadn't operated before. Complete opposite agenda for the UN Center for Transnational Cooperation than when it first started. Okay, this is a colonial metaphysics, right? There's no funds, you don't have any funds, you have a limited capacity to govern, so you've got to use it well to attract funds, and you've got to make sure that corruption is taken care of. Basically, that was what the agenda was in this counter-revolution of thought. Nothing beyond that. It was a direct attack on the ability of states to create some sort of national development agenda. That was the whole lot of it. And I don't think one needs to spend too much time on it, and I'm going to jump to now. That was then. Now, things are changing quite a bit. When Nkrumah talked about a neocolonial structure of the world economy, that was a structure that Samir Amin later said can be best understood using the concept of the 5 controls. And I want to go over these just to make sure there's clarity. Of the 5 controls that Samir wrote about, 3 of them have been deeply contested. The major global north countries don't control these 3. 2 of them are still controlled by the global north. So let me go over these 5. First, the 3 where there's a contest. Number 1, finance. There's a clip that came out on social media a while back of Marco Rubio, who's now the US Secretary of State, where he's sort of forlornly saying, if more and more countries start using local currencies to do trade, how will we sanction them? It's a very honest and straightforward question that Rubio asked. How will we sanction countries if they're not using the dollar? But of course, the dollar is not going to disappear as the principal currency for trade and for holding reserves. It's going to be there for a long time, largely because no other country is going to appear to take over from the dollar. In the sense that when you look at the Chinese currency, the Chinese are not going to substitute for the dollar. They are simply not prepared to reduce capital controls and allow Chinese assets to be traded on an international market. For that reason, it's almost impossible for the Chinese currency to stabilize the international trading system. This last meeting in Kazan, the BRICS talked a little bit about creating some sort of BRICS bundle, but I don't think this is going to happen for a long time. That doesn't mean that the control by the global north of the financial system hasn't weakened. It has certainly weakened. It's a contest. It has not been decided in any way, any real way. The second control, which has loosened and where there's a contest, is over raw materials. And I think the best example, again, is the uranium from Niger, where the government has said, look, we're not going to just surrender our raw materials, our uranium, to the French so that they can use it and pay us whatever they want to pay us. I think for a while, Zambia and the DRC, when they were talking about building a battery together and perhaps even a little car, before the US came in and said, let's do a three-way agreement, build the Lopito corridor. For a while, it looked like Zambia and the DRC were going to try to control their raw materials by themselves. So control over raw materials, highly contested now. It's not as easy as it was when, like a BHP or a Rio Tinto, one of the big, huge mining companies walk in and dictate the terms. Now, things are a little more complicated. There's a contest. The third area of control, and these are all Samir Amin's control, his kind of analytical framework. The third is science and technology. Here, there is certainly a contest. This is very different than it was in the era of the 1970s. It's a serious contest because there are now countries that are developing scientific and technological means that are, if not as good as what's produced in the global north, maybe even better. The very fact that many people on the African continent, Asia, many parts of Latin America have phones that are made in China by Chinese companies because they are cheaper and as good as the Apple phones, which are also made in China, that shows that there's a contest. Several of the countries on the continent are bargaining to get new internet tools from, let's say, the Chinese or the Indians, who are selling them on the open market, competing against US, German, and Scandinavian countries, firms from those countries. So in science and technology, there is a contest. That's already available to see. The two areas where there's no contest are important. The first is in war making. There's no contest in war making. We did a study at our institute. We found that the SIPRI numbers, the Stockholm Institute numbers, are completely deflated. They, in fact, take the US government's numbers at face value. In fact, it's incredible that they take it at face value. They claim that the Defense Department's budget is the budget for military spending, when in fact, the US government uses the Department of Energy to fund a lot of the nuclear weapons program. So you've got to bring everything in, Department of Veterans Affairs. So we took bits and pieces, audited the data, and when we came out with a number, and we did the same for other countries, we found that 74.3% of the share of global military spending is by the NATO plus countries. They are responsible for 74.3%. US military spending last year was $1.8 trillion. SIPRI is still saying 900 billion. It's completely a deflated number. Meanwhile, interesting, using the same methodology, the Russian share of world military spending is 4%. The Chinese share of military spending is 10%. Put those together, it's 14%. There is no comparison in terms of military spending, 74.3%. United States has 900 military bases around the world, 400 of them in the Pacific Ocean. In Niger, the governments of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali have said the French have to leave. But in Niger, they haven't yet asked the Americans to leave the base, which is in Agadez. It's the world's largest drone base. I didn't even know it was there. I was in Agadez driving around, and there's this enormous drone base sitting in the middle of the city from where they've been flying drones around the Sahara. Now, they claim that the drones are to help them figure out what's happening with the migration crisis. I mean, we can have a discussion about that later. It's an insane thing. So number 4 is war making, no contest. No other country has the forward projection to go and assault another country. Of course, the Russians are at war in Ukraine, but Russia can't threaten the United States except perhaps with the intercontinental ballistic missile, but I think that's even madness for them. I don't think it's happening. But the United States has forward projection, the Australians have forward projection, and so on. 74.3% of world military spending. We asked CIPRI to have a debate with us. They haven't responded. Okay. Then the fifth is information and education. The battle of ideas. There is no contest in the battle of ideas, none. Media, it is incredible how the media in the global north is able to shape our perceptions of ourselves. It's incredible. I mean, if the media in the West isn't talking about the conflict in Sudan, we say there's no conflict in Sudan. Somebody was mentioning there was a panel recently on Sudan, Libya, and a third one, Sudan, Libya, and Syria. And the panel title was Forgotten Conflicts. Those are not conflicts forgotten by the people of Sudan. So obviously it's through somebody else's eyes that you're seeing this conflict. It's an offensive way to describe a conflict, forgotten conflict. Definitely not by the people of Libya or Syria. Certainly not in Sudan. It's not forgotten for them. So we're seeing the world again, thou, thou, oh winter wind, through somebody else's eyes and casually, without even thinking about that somebody else is showing us our reality in their own way. We are not producing our own reality. This thing about information and education for me is centrally important. And I think that's one of the reasons why in our institute we started thinking, is there a way for us to no longer, in this new changing context, is there a way for us to try to think about the world order and development so that we're not just bringing in dependency theory from a different era and not trying to create a new development theory? I was struck by how dependency theory, when you read the texts again, seems so pessimistic in this era. It's not true in this era that there are no new possibilities, that there are no new opportunities. This is not the 1970s. This is a different era. If you go back and read Samir's article called China 2013, you'll discover that he's also thinking about something different. People point to his concept of delinking, but it's an empty concept. What does that mean? He says in that article from 1987, long time ago, the world has changed a lot since 87. The Soviet Union has collapsed. China has become a major economy. India has become a major economy. That article is from 1987. We have to think about the context. He says delinking. What does he mean? He says in that article, you need to put the national development agenda of a country ahead of the agendas of multinational corporations. How are you going to do that in 1987? The Soviet Union was going to collapse. You're going to get stuck with a World Bank report called Adjustment in Africa, Reforms, Results, and the Road Ahead. There was nothing in that report on delinking. In fact, the exact opposite. How to subordinate yourself fully to the agenda of multinational corporations. That's exactly what the World Trade Organization was pushing in its policy framework that was being delivered to the world in 1994. His article is from 87. It's really from another era. We need to think again about the possibilities of a development agenda. So toward that end, I want to make a few comments and then I'm going to recite a poem and close. There are maybe 2 points that are really important to put forward on the agenda. The first is we have to confidently think about what is political power. You can't have development unless you are able to build institutions of political power. If you have no institutions of political power, you can't advance an agenda. You can't advance your agenda against somebody else's agenda. I'm going to come back to this point, it'll become clearer. The second is you can't build a development project without the concept of planning. I mean, you talk about planning now and people roll their eyes and think, oh, the 5-year plan, whatever. I mean, in our context, big multinational corporations plan. The market produces a tyranny. We don't have a response to that from the side of the state. The state responds to the market plan that is shaped by large corporations. But states therefore have to have their own understanding of their own necessities and road ahead. If you don't plan, and if you don't have political power to drive a plan forward, then you're on the back foot for the entire duration of your hopes and dreams. You're in somebody else's cage, dancing around. You're not able to drive your own thinking into reality. So when you put these things together, and then you look at, let's say, as an example, the Chinese project, there's interesting observations come out of that. We in our institute looked really closely at how the Chinese were able to abolish absolute poverty. Because that's actually a concrete project within the last 10 years that would be beneficial for countries across the global south. To seriously study how another poor country was able to abolish absolute poverty. You look at the poverty numbers that the UN collects. If you take out the Chinese abolition of global poverty, net poverty rates have increased everywhere. It's the Chinese numbers that soften the rise in poverty. But we are not studying what the Chinese did. And one of the reasons we're not studying it is that point on information. Somehow it is inappropriate or it's scary to look at what the Chinese are doing or what they have done. One of the reasons the Chinese have been able to do this is that political power is not constituted in such a way that elites compete amongst themselves and use enormous amount of the social wealth to fight meaningless elections. That's not how political power is constituted. Political power is constituted on a different foundation. And that foundation is built into a plan. And the plan is to abolish poverty and increase the material needs of the people. I mean, people say, well, India is a democracy, China is not a democracy. If I was right now a landless peasant to be born anywhere in the world, I would not be born in India. That's the last place I'd want to be born. I would choose China any day. Having the ability to vote in an election in India is not going to feed my family or help myself study or improve my confidence as a person in the world. It's a ludicrous choice. It doesn't exist for people, most people in the world. So we took some of what China has done and we built a project called Global South Insights. In this project, which is a massive data study, we're trying to look at what has actually provided the Chinese with the possibility of growth since at least 1978. And trying to bring out from that concepts and agendas for a new development theory. Not to say that you just mimic what other countries have done, but let's look seriously at some of the concepts. What we have found, and this is a summary, what we found is that there's a high ratio of investment to GDP that leads to significant fixed capital formation. In other words, if a country is increasing its net fixed investment, the country is going to have a better chance of improving its growth rates. UNCTAD had done a series of reports where they showed that FDI does almost nothing to growth rates. Maybe nominal growth rate will increase, but the real growth rate is not going to be impacted by just FDI because it's going to go into finance and so on, what other people have shown. But net fixed investment has a high ratio, shows you that you're going to get a decent growth rate. What we also found was that there's an ultra-high correlation between GDP growth and a share of net fixed investment in GDP. So basically, forget all this stuff. Let me just get to the point. What we found is that if you're going to invest in infrastructure and industry, that is far better for a country in terms of improving life expectancy and a series of other indicators. There are some problems with how to balance this out. If you increase too much of your resources into investment and industry and decrease consumption, you're going to have short-term problems. So there's some things we're trying to work out now in terms of how to best measure this net fixed investment idea. It's all early days. But the point I want to put here is that we need to find tools for governments that come to power, like say a government in Senegal or the new government in Sri Lanka. They need a new development theory. What they don't need is merely critiques of the IMF theory. What are some elements that they can put into play? It's no longer a debate between industry and, let's say, health and education. Obviously, both have to be financed. So we have to first think about how do you raise finance? And that brings you to the question of sovereignty. What I discovered in 2 countries that sell gold is that they're selling gold at the spot price at the mine, not at the London price of the day. And the variance between the spot price at the mine and the London price, if you aggregate that over a year, it's sufficient to close their debt. Those kind of little things we have to put our minds to figuring out. We have to build a new development theory. We cannot simply be spending our time critical of the IMF. The IMF, in fact, is an institution of the past. New institutions are going to arrive. But these new institutions don't have a theory. We need to be building a theory collectively for this new moment. Many years ago, one of my favorite poets, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, when he was a young man, was in a town and he met a woman and they spoke to each other, and then they parted and he lost touch with her. 20, 30 years later, he went back to the town to read his poetry. He'd become one of the most famous poets, not only in Pakistan, but all across the Urdu-speaking world. And Faiz, when he was there, saw that this woman now was sitting in the audience, and she came up to him and she said, my husband is a big fan of yours, will you sign his book? And Faiz signed his book and went back to his hotel room, and he wrote one of his most beautiful poems. It's called Rakib Se, which means arrival in love. And the way he writes a poem, because he always writes poems like this, is beautiful. The poem is both about arrival in love for the heart of somebody, but also arrival for a people, between becoming a wealthy, strong country with a big military or erasing poverty in that country. His poem reflects a little bit, I think, on Gandhi's great line, test of a civilization is not the number of billionaires you have, but the absence of starvation among the masses. And so here is his poem, Rakib Se. जब कभी बिकता है बाजार में मजदूर का गोश्त, शाहराओं पे गरीबों का लहू बहता है. जब कभी बिकता है बाजार में मजदूर का गोश्त, whenever you sell in the bazaars the workers' flesh, शाहराओं पे गरीबों का लहू बहता है, when the blood of the workers flows down the avenues, आग सी सीने में रह रह के उबलती है न पूछ, अपने दिल पर मुझे काबू ही नहीं रहता है. आग सी सीने में रह रह के उबलती है न पूछ, fire burns in my chest, अपने दिल पर मुझे काबू ही नहीं रहता है. I have no control over my heart. जब कभी बाजार में बिकता है मजदूर का गोश्त, शाहराओं पे गरीबों का लहू बहता है, आग सी सीने में रह रह के उबलती है न पूछ, अपने दिल पर मुझे काबू ही नहीं रहता है. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for this passionate, informative, highly engaging presentation. I just have one question, actually. My question is connected to the question that I was going to ask, and Mohammed cut me off. But at any rate.
You mean you saved up your question from the previous
Yeah. No, because it's connected to what you said. In many ways, some of the ideas overlap, I noticed, in the conferences. And I'm going to just repeat some of what you said about the necessity to produce our own reality. And then you said that we need to develop new, we have to produce a new development theory.
Yeah.
So that's really very important. I think it's key. However, at the same time, we cannot do neither without creating our own language.
Our own what?
Language.
Language.
Because we cannot create a theory of any type without creating a language. So Because the language, I mean, as we understood it, especially like in the fields of linguistics, in the fields of philosophy of language, is not only a means of communication, is not only categories by which we communicate, but it also shapes our views. And as a matter of fact, Wittgenstein goes further as to say that language thinks for us. And I'm just going to give you an example. There's a term that we use quite commonly, I've always been uncomfortable with, which is the term of Global South. This term has come to being, I think, no more than 20 years ago. It replaced the term developing countries. And that term was in use for about 10 years, and it replaced the term third world. Third world was coming really from the third world. Actually, it was from Mao Zedong, to designate this population, all of us basically, that are caught between, on one hand, the first world, which is the United States and the Soviet Union at that time, and then the rest of Europe, and the rest is third world. This was a much more descriptive, much more analytical, term than developing country, because clearly we didn't develop. That's why they, dropped that term, and then they said the Global South. With the idea of the Global South is that you accept two ideas that are quite problematic, or maybe even three. You see what I mean? How a language can think of us, can make our own thinking, or can think for us. You accept three ideas. The first, you really buy into the ideas of the global. And second, you buy the idea of the South as separate from the rest, especially from the North. And third, you buy the idea of the inferiority of the South. And those are very complicated terms. So when I say that we need to create our own language, I do not mean that we need to reject English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and so forth. What I mean is we need to decolonize English, decolonize French, decolonize Portuguese, and of course, we need to find our own languages, meaning like Arabic, Hindi, or whatever language that we can place on a global stage. Thank you very much.
We get a couple. How does it go? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insightful...
I'm not a professor, but that's kind of you. Yeah.
Okay.
If I was a professor, I'd have health insurance.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for the wonderful
Mr. Speaker,
remarks indeed.
I sound like I'm in a parliament, Mr. Speaker. You're having trouble talking to me.
My pardon, yeah. Actually, I'm more interested in the points that you mentioned with regard to China. You praised the 1978 success story of China, and along the line, of course, it managed to uplift 600 to 800 million people from the shackles of poverty. Yeah, that's a remarkable history. And of course, in 2021, we saw China being able to achieve complete victory over absolute poverty. Now, China is just a developing country, just like most African countries are. And in terms of the population dynamics, Africa and China, they're just close. What is it that we can learn from China in terms of what our governments can be able to do to be able to move from poverty to prosperity? Because the fight on poverty on the continent is still a challenging component. And of course, back to the story of China, whereby 600 million people to 800 million people are lifted out of poverty. That significantly represented about 75% of global poverty reduction. Thank you so much.
Is there one more somewhere? It'll be the last.
Greetings, Commissar Prashad.
Nice.
Thank you very much for an informative and a passionate speech or rather lecture. You speak of creating a new theory of development. I mean, I'm assuming that in the process of creating a new theory of development, it includes publications, right? So that the information can reach policymakers and it can reach, the people or the masses. But I mean, I have an issue with the conventional way of disseminating information. I mean, for example, we write journal articles, right? Universities, actually governments, right? They pay a lot of subsidies towards universities so that scholars can produce information. And scholars, they go and publish in these so-called high impact, high quartile journal publications. And universities have to pay for that open access. So when you publish, you write, the government commissions you, you write, you submit to a journal, you have to pay for people to have access to that journal at the end of the day. I mean, when you look at the revenue of Elsevier's, the revenue of Taylor and Francis, of Springer is quite crazy, and they don't do anything except just leech on the scholars, right? So I mean, don't you think that it is necessary at some point for anyone who's involved, right, in the process of creating information in the new development era to sort of depart from the conventional ways, right, of publication and create our own publications in our own universities that do not exploit, the resources of our people, because the money that subsidizes the scholars is the resources and the hard work of our people. Do you think is it still necessary? Are these Taylor and Francis Springer, sorry to name drop if there's any of the reviewers here, are they still relevant in trying to articulate a new developmental agenda for our African economies? And then my second question, which is the last one. I mean, when you look at socialism, right, or communism in its development, I mean, most African countries, right, they will blame the collapse of the Berlin Wall and say, the reason why we did not pursue it post-independence, like South Africa, they will say it's because Russia fell as a superpower, communism fell globally. I mean, do you think that China still has a role to play that is similar to the USSR in terms of assisting the global South that's willing to pursue a more leftist developmental agenda, right? Because if you pursue a leftist developmental agenda, the global North will sort of try and push back. And if they push back, you sort of need someone that's going to pay to sort of, do you think the Chinese have been doing enough, or they've been just focusing on their own? Mm-hmm. And do you think we still need more of that who can support us? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, the China question is a great question, but we can't repeat history. You can't either have China become the USSR, or you can't make the Chinese Revolution in Zimbabwe in the same way. You can't repeat history. It never repeats. We have to learn from the past. Nobody wants the Chinese to be the savior. One of the interesting things was, I was reporting the story about Entebbe Airport. I don't know if anybody saw this story. There was a Bloomberg story that said that the Chinese, not the People's Bank of China, I've forgotten the name of the bank, had given a loan to rebuild Entebbe Airport. And that because the government couldn't service the debt, China was going to take over Entebbe Airport. That was the Bloomberg story. So I wrote to my editor and said, look, this is fascinating. Can I go and have a look and see what's going on? So I flew into town and I went to the government offices and I talked to people in the finance ministry, and they said a couple of interesting things. Then I went to the Chinese embassy and I talked to them. The government officials said an interesting thing. One of the things they said is that in fact they hadn't read the final agreement that they had signed. That they didn't have enough people to go over the agreement. They just signed it because it was a lot of money. Secondly, there was no clause. There was no springback clause that if the debt isn't serviced, they can take over the asset. That's ridiculous. It's the main airport in the country. You're not going to give the airport up, yeah? That was made up by Bloomberg. But the guy then went into the subcommittee, the government official that I had spoken to, and he said in the subcommittee meeting, which you can see on YouTube, that in fact, we didn't read the grant before we signed it. So what I'm trying to get at is, it's not China that's going to save, African state projects. We have to create our own agendas. When they come and say we have investment for industrialization, if we don't have a national plan, then the money is just going to come in and create chaos. I mean, the example of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka is so instructive. The Chinese government came and they said, look, there's private funding in China, the banks and so on, and a construction company. They want to help you because the Sri Lankans had said, we want to build a deep water port. So the Chinese government said, we can arrange the funding for it. But then they did a feasibility study, joint feasibility study, and said that the project should be managed in 2 phases. Build phase 1, open the port, start earning revenue, and when you've reached the revenue threshold of X, then take the second tranche of investment. That was the feasibility study that they jointly did. Rajapaksha's government, completely ridiculous government, insisted they wanted the money in one go. So the Chinese bank said, we are not going to give you the money in one go. Look at the feasibility study. So they overrode the feasibility study and said, we want the money. So they gave them the money. So then the port was basically not able to be, to make a profit. And this story is not just me telling you the story. You can read it at the Atlantic magazine. 2 American professors went and looked at it. And the story is called something like the myth of debt trap diplomacy. They look at the Hambantota port. You see, these are instructive examples. The Chinese are coming with offers. The Indian government is coming with offers. Indonesia as well, with offers on the table for industrialization financing. But if you don't have a plan, if you don't have an idea of what you want to do, if you don't have good, realistic, importantly research feasibility studies, nothing is going to happen. So that's a key thing, is we have to build our own agendas. You can't expect somebody to come and save you. Yeah, because they have their own agenda. The Chinese will have their own agenda, as they should. They are not doing this messianically. They have their own agenda. They also are looking for markets. The Belt and Road Initiative is a way for them to pivot away from reliance on the US market, which is no longer going to be the market of last resort. So they are looking for new markets. That's transparent. All countries, even a socialist country, is going to have national interests and perhaps international interests. But the national interests are there. We can't minimize it, yeah? So you've got to have your own agenda. I mean, when you think about the Chinese project, in our institute, we've spent a lot of time trying to excavate the debates within China amongst intellectuals. So there's a journal that we publish. You can read it on the institute website. It's called Wenhua Zhongheng. We've translated the best articles from this journal. It's a leading Chinese journal. We've translated the best articles into English, Spanish, Portuguese, a whole range of languages. Because I want people to know what are the debates in China. How are the Chinese intellectuals understanding their own development project? We did a study with Chinese intellectuals on how they were able to get beyond poverty, absolute poverty. We need to listen to them. The communication gap is real. You know, it's a real communication gap. And intellectually, that gap is enormous. Because, you see, remember I said in the realm of information and education, there is no contest. You see, you still get Global North institutions, Fulbrights, Ford Foundation, all this machinery of intellectual production from the Global North churning through southern countries. And, the Chinese are nowhere, the Indians are nowhere in this. These are big, flourishing economies. But they don't think about, building educational bridges and so on. The cultural, educational exchanges of BRICS are useless. From the first BRICS meeting, there was a suggestion about academic visas, academic exchanges. It's just not happening. Yeah? So we have to do it ourselves. We have to build these kind of conversations. So I'm not going to tell you how they did it. I'm going to invite you to read Wenhua Zhongheng and read and see how the Chinese understand their process in their terms. There's an issue that we edited. Grieve wrote the introduction to it, which is on China and Africa. I think it's 3 Chinese scholars writing about their understanding of industrialization on the African continent. It's an excellent set of essays. Okay? Look, the question of JSTOR and so on, you made the point yourself. Yeah, we need to circulate our own ideas to ourselves. We can't give it up to multinational corporations in the same way as you give them mining rights in your country. It's the same logic.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.